Imagine if we could retool the way we think of guns in America so gun violence doesn't lead every news story. And our action heroes are not venerated for the violence and vengeance they can extract. For 200 years, guns in America were seen primarily as tools for protection of livestock and for recreation. How did we lose that, and how do we get back to that? When 20 children and 6 women were killed at the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in 2012, I was handed the biggest challenge of my career as an FBI agent. Work with the White House and federal and local agencies to stop the killing. We did what you would expect. We worked nights and weekends. I slept with my phone. We pushed out the now familiar run, hide, fight advice for civilians and spent millions developing best practices and developing good police protocols. When I sat down to write the FBI's first ever research on active shooter incidents, my team had access to hundreds of police reports dating back to Columbine High School. And we learned middle school kids and high school kids shoot up their own schools. And in the K through 12 environment, Mondays are the danger days. But in colleges, Fridays. We learned for every 1 shooting in a school, there were 2 shootings in places of business, and fired employees kill their bosses. We saw an average of 11 incidents every year. And when I retired, the numbers were still going up. So I wrote a book, and I started a podcast to share what I'd learned. But the numbers were still rising. By 2020, there were 40 incidents counted in 1 year. The next year, 61. I had started the FBI's active shooter program, but a decade later, in our gun-obsessed culture, I could see that it had failed. I felt that I had failed miserably. So I keep this card. For years, I've kept it on the top of my desk at home. It's a quote from Edward de Bono. Dr. de Bono is a Maltese physician. He coined the term lateral thinking. It says, sometimes the situation is only a problem because it's looked at a certain way. Looked at in another way, the right course of action might be so obvious that the problem no longer exists. It was lateral thinking that helped me realize that I needed to have the FBI study active shooter incidents in isolation in order for us to understand them. So now I thought I needed to apply lateral thinking again. I needed to change my lens, open my aperture, and set aside my look at active shooter incidents because they account for less than 2/100ths of all firearms deaths in the United States. So I turned to the Center for Disease Control because they track all firearms deaths. And I found 60% of all firearms deaths are suicides, most prominently older white men in rural communities. 80% of all homicide victims, men. 50 to 70% of all violence has a domestic nexus. And though I knew that about 100 people were killed every year in these very, very public active shooter incidents, 500 were killed every year when an unsecured gun is found, often by a child, and an innocent person is killed. Now, firearms are the leading cause of death in the United States for children and teens ages 1 to 19. You know, as I opened my aperture, I could see that we looked for ways to keep guns out of the hands of troubled people. We talked about banning certain weapons and universal background checks. We looked for better resources for mental health, suicide prevention, and domestic violence. There were laws passed, like red flag laws. In San Jose, California, for example, a gun owner must show proof of insurance in order to be sure that they bear the cost of any resulting gun violence. But as I opened my aperture further, I could see more hurdles. Gun manufacturing has doubled in the last decade. During the pandemic, 60 million guns were sold, 5% of those to first-time purchasers. That is 12 million new gun owners. So again, I think, why is everyone so obsessed with having a gun and having that solve their problems? So I began to think, when my daughter was 3 or 4, she was obsessed with owning a toy gun. She would stalk kids on the playground to sneak up behind them and maybe take a spy at their toy gun or maybe join in the play. Every rifle was a stick. Every finger and thumb became a handgun pointed at an imaginary target. But I didn't relinquish that demand. I knew about gun violence. I was a prosecutor at the time in Chicago, and I knew the result of gun violence, and I didn't want my kids to think of gun violence as fun. They were fortunate enough to be raised in a nice neighborhood where we didn't hear gunfire at night. And I knew that because I had been raised in a nice neighborhood, and I was certain that I had not been raised around guns and gun violence. Until I realized that I was. Guns are woven into the fabric of the American culture. Guns have become our culture, particularly with the dominance of television and movies in the 60s and 70s. Video games are just the latest iteration. Generations alive today fought in wars. Their children played with green plastic army men on the floor. Baby boomers played cowboys and Indians outside, and they came inside at night to watch Justice Served by the Rifleman and the Lone Ranger. We watched Have Gun, Will Travel on primetime television. We watched Wanted, Dead or Alive. Walt Disney's Davy Crockett, he proudly carried his rifle, Old Betsy, everywhere. And the interest in cap guns and BB guns waned only as paintball guns, Nerf guns, and video game consoles came into popularity. You know, at first our weapon-carrying heroes had complex personalities, and they tried to avoid violence. Marshal Matt Dillon from Gunsmoke, Batman, Indiana Jones. But soon, these weapon-carrying heroes were replaced by action heroes. And action heroes, they don't wait for justice, they seek vengeance. Rambo, Dirty Harry, John Wick. On the big screen, guns became everyday tools of survival. And I think without realizing it, Americans collectively came to believe that a gun was the answer to every conflict. Our human heroes became anyone with the biggest, fastest, and most destructive gun. Guns became our heroes. Violence in films has doubled since the 1950s, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics. And now, opening scenes require seemingly endless ammunition to kill characters we have never even met. I mean, baby boomers and Gen Xers, we perfected America's gun culture. But millennials and Gen Zs and Gen Alphas, you have inherited it. For our first 200 years, gun owners and non-gun owners alike viewed guns as dangerous but controllable tools. How did we lose sight of that? How did this cultural change occur? I think we slid into it by mistake. This isn't a choice we made to go to war. This is more like the pandemic or the depression. It kind of crept up on us, and then I think that we ignored some of the signs. Either way, it doesn't matter because we can't go back. I know I can't go back after talking to parents whose murdered children could only be identified through DNA. The television and movie industry has an organization that seeks to make change from within. It's called the Entertainment Industries Council. They have guidelines to encourage accurate depictions for suicide and mental health. They're the ones who help to get cigarettes out of the mouths and hands of our stars. Today, they're working with industry executives to change their gun culture. They're looking at terminology and asking creators to please write characters where the gun is not the hero. They're looking for changes in props and movie posters. But, we have a role to play too because they give us what we ask for in our ticket purchases. So maybe consider how you might look for stronger character development in a role as opposed to gratuitous violence. The entertainment industry has not been the only influencer. The National Rifle Association was created after the Civil War, and for its first 100 years was the primary force pushing for federal and state legislation and gun licensing regulations. Their motto focused on gun safety and gun education. But in the 1970s, in a huge disservice to gun owners, NRA leadership aligned with gun manufacturers, and for the next 50 years, the NRA and the politicians funded by them created an us versus them environment between gun owners and non-gun owners. And then I think we stopped thinking about the cultural impact. And where conflict was once resolved with words and fists, policemen now work and law enforcement now works in a country that has more guns than people. And women in the United States are more likely to be killed by a firearm, 21 times more likely to be killed by a firearm than women in similarly wealthy countries. My profession made me a skilled and safe gun owner. And you may be one too and think this is not your problem because you know how to protect yourself and your family. But should we think that way? Is that a little short-sighted? I don't want to carry my gun with me every time I go to the grocery store or take my family out for dinner. We all want the same thing, less gun violence. But like an unattended fungus, we have allowed this culture to grow. And now we must use lateral thinking to find the changes that we not only want, but the changes we need. It's not easy, but we have done it before. Airport protocols have changed. We shop and pay for our bills online. We wear bike helmets and seatbelts. And we no longer think of piercings and tattoos as unprofessional. I think about what I can do. I keep my guns secured. I curate my entertainment purchases to avoid gratuitous violence. And I discourage gun purchases except for protection of livestock, collectors, and recreation. More guns on the street will not keep us safer. How are we going to make this cultural change? There's no single path. There's no easy solution. But I think, for example, if you are not a gun owner, maybe stop sanctimoniously vilifying all gun owners while you watch your action films and play your video games. And if you are a gun owner, maybe stop thinking that everybody is out to take your guns away when nobody has done that in 200 plus years, and instead demonstrate and most importantly discuss gun safety. I invite you to think of a way to bring us back so that guns are not symbols of superiority and power, where guns are not the heroes of our stories, where our heroes in real life and on the big screen solve conflict with words and use guns for sport. How long will that take? Maybe generations. But I invite you to open your aperture and think of guns differently. And maybe then we will live in the gun culture that we say we want, not the gun culture that we have embraced. Thank you.